Hello and welcome to Risk Awareness Week. My name is Graeme Keith. I'm an independent consultant working out of Copenhagen in Denmark. Before I went independent, I was head of enterprise risk management and head of strategy at Maersk Oil. This was a deliberate combination of strategy and risk management, and actually you can see I've written about this several times, I've published on LinkedIn about the very tight relationship between strategy on the one hand and risk management, and essentially my belief that strategy and risk management are essentially the same things. Risk management is all about making the right decisions under uncertainty, and strategy as well, it's all about making decisions under uncertainty. So what I'm going to do talking about here is I'm going to be talking a little bit about that in action. And what I'm going to be doing is drawing a lot on a presentation I gave earlier in the week, where I talked about a method called causal mapping, very closely related to influence diagrams, may actually be exactly the same as influence diagrams, but I'm coming at it from a slightly different perspective. And the idea here, and this is something I explained in detail in the last presentation, is that these are a tool that allow people to build mathematical quantitative models to help people to make informed decisions. And the tool, the power of this tool is partly it allows you to access the data, leverage the data intelligently, but actually much more critically, it allows you to bring a lot of people around the table. It allows you to bring their expertise to bear. It allows you to exploit what they know and what they understand about their business. It brings them very close to the mathematical model without actually having to get their feet wet in the mathematics. Now, I would warmly recommend that you go back and see on repeat the presentation that I gave earlier in the week, because it will set a lot of the themes in terms of what I'm doing and how I'm going about it, and what the goal of this thing is and what the advantages of this thing is. This is really an example that illustrates the things that I was talking about in that last presentation. Okay, so adopting the principles that I talked about in the last presentation, one of the things that came up a number of times was whenever we build a model that's trying to describe something, we have to start with the objectives, that's this thing here, and the decisions, that's this thing here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about assets in a fairly broad sense within oil and gas. So we're talking about producing assets, oil platforms sitting out in the sea perhaps, pumping oil up from the ground and selling it off. But we're also talking about assets in terms of more speculative opportunities, so licenses for going out and exploring for oil, or maybe buying into a project where oil has been discovered but there's no facilities for developing it yet. Those sorts of investments. So it's assets in a sort of fairly broad sense. And what I'm going to do to start with is to develop a model and show how we use causal mapping to build models of oil and gas assets. What I'm not going to do today is I'm not going to get into the mathematics. I'm not going to do any of the quantitative modeling at all. It would take too long and it would require too many sort of prerequisites in terms of the mathematics. But in a sense, I'm kind of cheating a little bit, because that's really the essence of this methodology. What this methodology is all about is about showing you that you can actually develop a model, show people how you're going to model things, show people how you're going to use data, show people most of the assumptions that are in the model without really doing any mathematics at all. And that's really the message that I want to try and get across today, is that this tool is very powerful for doing that. So how do we do this? Well, we start off with our objective, which in this term is cash flow. Could be anything, could be NPV, could be return on investment, could be lots of other things, but I'm just going to talk about cash flow because it's relatively straightforward. And then you just go back from that and you say, okay, what influences cash flow? What variables do we have, can we measure, where we know that a different value of that variable will influence the cash flow in some way? And this is very simple. Obviously, we have sales revenue, we're selling the oil. We have costs, operating expenditure here, and we have our capital investment here. And that's the first point. Now, I'm working back from the objectives backwards towards the decisions here. I can also work forward from the decisions and up, but in this particular case, it's easier just to keep working backwards. So I say, all right, so that's that. So what next? Well, sales revenue, I know, just how much oil I produce multiplied by the price I can sell it at. So that's relatively straightforward. And we just keep working backwards and keep cascading backwards. Now, production, if I start down here, Question's a function of two things. It's how good is the reservoir? Is it a reservoir that flows easily? Can I easily get oil out of the ground? And it's also to do with things like uptime, how much my facilities are running, the things breaking down a lot. I'm having to shut down because there's emergency situations or there are terrorists or whatever. So there's a sort of production efficiency, basically how much this is how much reservoir performance is how much I can produce, and production efficiency is how much I am producing, and those two things together, they influence the function. Now, I left something very important out of the cash flow here, and I'm taking this in the same step. Obviously, we have to pay tax. Now, it's easy actually to turn to this in terms of government take, because it's not always that oil revenues are just taxed directly. And actually, in a lot of the oil producing parts of the world, we have what are called production sharing contracts. And that's quite interesting because what that allows you to do is not use a proportion of the money you make to pay off your costs. What it does is it says you can have a proportion of the oil that you produce, you can sell to cover your costs. Now that's interesting because it makes cost recovery, so which is the amount that you're essentially offsetting on a yearly basis in your tax calculation, that cost recovery becomes a function of oil price. And here you start seeing the power of this causal mapping. Without doing any mathematics, I've now made the realization that oil price not only affects my cash flow in terms of sales revenue, it actually also has an interesting effect in terms of how much tax I pay. Now, this is a very interesting phenomenon as far as putting together an oil and gas portfolio is concerned. Because generally what happens is when you have very high oil prices, it's very little of the oil. You need very little oil to cover the cost of what you can cost recover in that year. And what that means is that most of the oil you produce is essentially given to the government. So when the oil price is high, then the government take is high. So these are assets where these might be sort of Middle Eastern production sharing contracts. High oil price, you don't do very well. The government's taking a big cut. On the other hand, when the oil price is very low, it's a lot of the oil that you produce that you need to cover the costs. And in that case, the government take is a lot smaller. Now that's very nice because what it does is it means that when the oil price is very low, those assets are working very well for you. And a lot of the game of constructing an oil and gas portfolio is making sure that you have some sort of exposure to upside, some sort of assets where when the oil price is high, you can make a lot of money because that's paying for all the other things. But also you have some protection so that if the oil price tanks like it did in 2014, you still have assets that can keep the cash flowing and can keep the company afloat. And we saw this very clearly in 2014. The companies that had those kinds of assets were much better able to weather the storm. So it's a question of getting that balance right. And that's essentially where we're going with this. We're going to talk about how to model portfolios and how to get that balance right. But what's nice about this is that it shows you that you can see those relationships and understand those relationships without necessarily getting into the detailed mathematics. And this sort of sneaky little relationship of oil price on cash flow is something that maybe isn't obvious, but it's something that comes very naturally out of the mapping. Okay, still not quite back to my maintenance and safety policies yet. And I'm talking here about an asset which I own. I'm not talking about buying or selling it yet. We'll talk about that in a minute. So really what I have when I'm running an asset is it's my policies. It's how do I manage safety? How do I manage maintenance and reliability? And those are the policies. And clearly maintenance and safety, they can affect uptime. They can affect safety performance, which in turn is affecting this quantity, which is how much of what is possible am I actually producing. But of course, these policies, they also affect cost. And if they're involving capital investment, they're also affecting capital investment as well. So this is a relatively simple model. I can set this up and I can actually use this directly, and we have used these sort of things directly, to make choices about resource distribution and maintenance safety policies. Is it worth a very expensive reliability and inspection program? So that will kind of come through cost and that will hit the cash flow in that direction, but it'll also improve the uptime. And then that cascades very nicely through these things, and we can see how it hits the cash flow. So this is a very simple model. Everyone understands how we're doing the modeling. And what I can do is I can go in at each of these connections and I can say, all right, this is how I'm going to make this connection mathematically. So for example, with uptime, which is simply, you know, the percentage of the time the machines will be running, I can look back historically and say, okay, with this maintenance program, uptime is typically this for these kinds of assets in these kind of places. Use historical data for that. And for this alternative maintenance program, uptime is this with these kinds of assets in these kind of places. Again, historical data. And then I have a statistical relationship between a choice that I'm making at the decision level and then the outcome that I'm trying to model here. Obviously, the cost is very easy to model through here, and that's a relatively straightforward connection. And what you do simply is you go through these things connection by connection, and you can have a discussion about, without necessarily getting into the mathematics, you can have a discussion about data provenance. Where does the data come from to make this relationship? What does that relationship look like? Now, that's fine, but it's a little bit unsatisfactory, because really you're sitting there with maintenance and safety, and it's not that many things you can affect, and we're not at all getting into this cost recovery portfolio balance thing that we were talking about before. So what I want to do is I want to take level back one. I want to take a big step back, and I say, okay, I've got my asset here. I know I can do things with maintenance safety at an individual asset level, but what can I do at a portfolio level? And again, we see here one of the big powerful components of this causal analysis, which is that we have a relatively well-defined framework for just taking a bunch of stuff and lumping it all in together. And that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to take all of this stuff here, all of this complexity here, and just going to lump it into a big complicated function that I'm going to call asset. Now, if I want to, I can pack that out and I can show people how it works. But what I'm saying here is that I have some maintenance and safety policies, and I have and they affect the asset. Now we can see over here that they affect them in several ways. That doesn't matter. What I'm saying is I have a bunch of stuff here that's affecting a bunch of stuff here, and I have oil prices also affecting. So I have a very sort of simple portfolio level model of that asset, and that's one of the powerful things about causal analysis, is it allows you to do that sort of lumping and splitting processes. So then what I do is I say, well, actually, I'm interested in a portfolio. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this to all of my assets. So now I have all of my assets, and I know that oil price is affecting them. That's the same oil price for all of them. It's not the same gas price, and if you're doing this for gas, it gets quite interesting, but same oil price for all of them. And presumably the same maintenance and safety policies. Now, there'll be different individual decisions, but you know what you can do is you can, and again, you can split that up and you can make that explicit in the model. So here on here you could say maintenance and safety policies for that one, and then that will be in turn a function of the global, the corporate maintenance and safety policies. So that what you have there is you've done this thing where you're looking at an asset level, you might be looking at a country level, and you might be making decisions at an asset and country level, and then you can roll it back and make it sort of corporate level where you have sort of global things, and you can make those absolutely explicit. And that's very powerful. Now, what we're really doing here is we're saying what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to affect things like government take and oil price we can't do anything about, maybe sort of OPEX, reservoir performance. We'd like to get into some better reservoirs. Obviously, we can't do anything about any given asset, but we can affect these things through a sort of portfolio effect. And the way we do that is very simply by looking at the assets we have, looking at the assets we could gain access to, and saying, okay, let's look at different combinations of those things and see whether we can put a portfolio together that has the desirable qualities in terms of exposure to upside and protection from downside. Now, oil price is a big part of that. That's a very important component, the most important component. But actually, technical risk is also very important here as well. So there's a lot of work around subsurface uncertainty. What's the probability that we'll find oil? If we find oil, is it going to be big or is it going to be small? And there's a trade-off there, because very often the biggest things are in the newest areas that we know least about. So they have the biggest risk associated to them. They have the least likely, the smallest chance of success. And the biggest uncertainty about how much is actually in place, but potentially the biggest win. The other side of that is more mature areas where we know a lot about the play, we know a lot about what's on the subsurface, but all the big stuff has already been drilled, so there's only little stuff left to go for. So there's a sort of risk-reward game to be played there. And what we're doing is we're simply playing those games at a portfolio level. We're looking to have a balance of the high risk, high reward things that can really sort of, if we're lucky or if the oil price is high, we can win big. But at the same time, we want to make sure that we can survive on a year-to-year basis. We can keep the cash flowing. We can keep the company rolling over. So that's the game here. And this is very simple. We look at what we have and we say, okay, we're going to switch some of these things off and sell them. And then we look at what we could buy and we're going to say we're going to sell some of these things and buy them. And what we want to be able to do is to model different combinations and see what the overall effect is on the thing that we're interested in, which I've said here is cash flow, but could easily be NPV or return metric or something like that. Any questions, any comments, please write them in and we'll try and address those as soon as we can. But what we're looking at here is we've gone from, this is, where are we? We're looking at the asset model here. We can see what we can influence directly. We can influence uptime, safety performance, which also has an impact on CapEx and OpEx. But when we look at the portfolio model, there's a bunch of things. We're not sort of influencing it directly, but we're changing the balance of these things in the portfolio. So we can choose assets that have different profiles in terms of government take, in terms of how the government take responds to oil price. Obviously, you know, we're making choices about what we're going to spend money on, and we're making choices about the kinds of places in the world. Some places are cheaper to develop than others, so that will also affect the operating expenses. We can make choices about reservoir performance. Now, this is both whether there's oil in the ground and how much there is, but it's also, does it flow well? Is it good reservoir quality? Can we get a lot of oil out quickly, or do we have to drill lots and lots of holes and frack and things like that? So there's a whole bunch of skills that suddenly are on the table. Now, they're on the table at a portfolio level. We can't influence these things directly. I mean, once you've bought an asset, you can't change the reservoir in it. But what we can do is we can trade different pieces of reservoir, and there's a lot of things that are going into that trade, which is why the model of these things is so important. But again, the point here is that we can illustrate the model to quite a high degree of faithfulness and give the people who are involved in building the model a lot of ownership around the model without getting into that detailed mathematics. Okay, now this is the sort of basic thing, and what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to say, okay, I want to be able to look at different combinations with different values in these different boxes here. But it's very important to realize that I can't control these boxes any more than I can control oil price. What I can control is things like, what country do I go to? And what kind of contracts does it have in the country? Do I go onshore where it's cheap to drill, but relatively small finds in the places that have been drilled out? Or do I go offshore where there's a little bit more to go after, but it's a little bit more expensive? Am I interested in deep water where there are some huge fields, but obviously it's very expensive and very risky? And then, so where in the world, onshore, offshore, oil or gas, various decisions like that. And this can be modeled at different levels. So we can model it at a sort of level of, okay, I want to understand what my ideal portfolio should look like, what proportion of onshore, offshore, deep water, what proportion in, you know, Northwest Europe, Africa, North America, and so on. That's a sort of broad analysis, and there's a lot of data out there, proprietary data that I can get hold of and use to condition that analysis. But it might also be that having done that analysis, I've whittled it down to a few places, and then I'm interested in, okay, now I have 10 or 15 different things that I've modeled. Let's look at the different combinations and see how they work with the rest of our portfolio. And again, one of the huge advantages of this causal mapping is that it's very simple to go from large-scale crude models and then to split it out and refine it and make a more sophisticated model, but likewise to pack the sophisticated model up and go back to the large scale. And what that allows you to do is it allows you to verify the assumptions you make at different levels, and that's, again, a very powerful tool. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the crude model for sort of getting exploration proportions right, onshore, offshore, deep water, different countries, that sort of thing. And then I'll just talk very briefly at the end about a sort of slightly more sophisticated model for an individual. Really what I'm doing here is trying to illustrate the power of the causal mapping methodology, one of the powerful things of it being this scalability. So the sorts of things that I'm interested in, they are jurisdiction, we've talked about that. Play maturity is very important. Is it a new area? If it's a new area, then it's riskier, we know less about it. more uncertainty on how big things are and whether things are connected, but potentially much bigger fines. And then, you know, we've got these sort of sweet spots where, you know, everything works, but there's still quite a lot to go after. Of course, the downside of those is they're expensive to get into. There's a sort of, you know, workhorse play where things have sort of been going for a while. There's still some discoveries, and you know, they're not maybe that so expensive to get into. And then there's late life, which is really sort of playing a game using the facilities that are already there. And there's different kinds of maturity. There's the play maturity, which is how much you've drilled into that particular kind of geology, and then there's infrastructure maturity, which is how much infrastructure is there. That's quite an interesting distinction to make. In the North Sea, for example, it's very infrastructure mature, but there's still some plays in the North Sea that are relatively new. So people are going deeper and deeper, and they're going into different geological strata, and they're going right down into the base rock, and those open up new possibilities, but there's still a lot of infrastructure that can be used there, so that's very exciting. And then we've got the whole question about onshore in the mountains, which is incredibly expensive, shallow water, deep water, ultra deep water. Now, each of these things, and this is again this issue of, you know, working back from the objectives and also working forward from the decisions. These are the decisions. There's jurisdiction, maturity, and terrain are the actual decisions. And then I'd say work forward from there. So what does it affect? Well, jurisdiction is very much about the contract types, but it's also about what different parts of the world have in terms of their in terms of how prolific they are from an oil and gas point of view. Play maturity is really all about uncertainty and size. And also reservoir quality to a certain extent. So we're just calling about reservoir performance. Then we have infrastructure maturity. If the infrastructure is there and it's good, then it's cheap to develop. That's nice. If it's not there, then it's expensive because you have to build it. And if it's there and it's dying, then it's expensive because you have to kind of make a lot of modifications and get stuff in. So that's really affecting your capital expend, but it's also affecting your lifting costs and your tariffs and things like that. And then terrain, onshore, offshore is really just a question of drilling costs and development costs. Now, again, very nice to do this because this is a conversation you can have with anybody. So you can get people around the table and we can have these conversations about what are the decisions we're making, what do the decisions affect, and how do those consequences feed into the model that I'm using to model the objective that I'm trying to achieve. And again, we haven't got into the mathematics, but it's not difficult for people to imagine that little next step. There's a lot of work in that little next step, but in people's minds, it's a little next step to actually sort of putting the mathematics around it. So that's what we do. We're going to take jurisdiction, maturity, I've just put them together, and terrain. And then I can see where do these plug in to the model. And we can have a conversation about that. This brings me on to another point, which is that once we've done this, we can then go out to the data and we can say, okay, this is my causal hypothesis, if you like. And you can test those causal hypotheses against what we're seeing in the data. This is what we did. We did this for both portfolio design and for individual ventures. There's a lot of proprietary data about sort of historical performance. So we can go out there and we can say, okay, let's look at how lifting costs and daily expense, operating expenses, let's see how they change as a function of where you are in the world and whether you're onshore and offshore. And you can find out what's important and what's not important. And so you can start building models for how to model cost as a function of the decisions you're making, which is onshore, offshore, can't see that now, where you are in the world and maturity. So once we've been through that exercise, we find that not all of these causal links are supported by the data, so we can remove them. It's a much more powerful way of approaching data than the sort of blind way of that's quite common now with artificial intelligence and machine learning, because there you're actually giving it information about what you believe the causal relationships to be. Now, there's a bit of a jury's a little bit out on these things. People could argue, well, I can use artificial intelligence to find relationships, and then I can have a discussion about whether they're causal or not. Artificial intelligence is not yet very good at establishing causality. It's one of the big weaknesses of it. It's very good at finding relationships, but it's not very good at finding causal relationships or demonstrating causal relationships, because that's quite hard. And I think one of the big advantages of this, and the power that I think I've enjoyed from using it in my work, is that what it does is it allows experts to talk about what they're good at and what they know about, which is relationships and how things influence each other. And it doesn't ask them to come up with, you know, probabilities or probability distributions, which, with actually no exceptions as far as I can remember, people just aren't very good at. So what it does is it says, let's establish the relationships, and then we go to the data. So we let the data do the quantitative work, we let the mathematicians do the modeling, and then we allow the experts to really talk about and really understand what they know about. And that's really about setting up the causal diagram so that we understand what it is we're modeling and how we're modeling it and how we're using data. Okay, so once we've done this, once we've built this model, when we have maybe 4 or 5 different jurisdictions that we're looking at, we will filter these. We won't go anywhere in the world, so we'll just look at, you know, a bunch of places that we think are good candidates. We'll look at different maturities, and it won't be every place that has every level of maturity, so that will also, there'll be some filtering there, and it won't be every place that has onshore, offshore, and deep water, so there'll be some filtering there. So we end up with a handful of possibilities, essentially a convolution of these 3 decision groups. And then we just simply go out and model all the different combinations. So we say, okay, we'll start off with 100% onshore North Africa. I mean, we wouldn't do that, but you know, you could start there, and then you sort of take some of it out and put it into some other places, and you explore that big space of possibilities, distributing the resources between different areas, distributing the resources between different kinds of facility. And what you do there is you generate, for each one of those, you run this model, and you get a sense of, what does the upside look like? And this isn't for individual assets, this is for the whole portfolio. So you're saying, okay, what does it look like on a good day if things go well for us? What's the upside? And what's the downside? What happens if the oil price tanks? Or what happens if these big, high risk, high reward ventures that we go into fail? What does it look like then? And what that allows you to do is to go in and say, okay, I have a level of risk that I'm not prepared to exceed. I don't want to lose more than a certain amount each year. I don't want to spend more than this amount of money replacing my reserves or whatever. I have some sort of risk metric, and then I can say, what's the best I can do subject to that constraint? Or I might be a little bolder, and I can just say, all right, I'm just going to put myself out there and take the chance and try to get the biggest return I can, the biggest win I can. How am I going to do that? But what it allows you is a sort of informed discussion about that trade-off between the risk, the volatility, the uncertainty on the one hand, and then the potential reward on the other. Just very briefly, just to round out, I said I'd talk a little bit about how you do this when you have specific opportunities. So at this level, I'm looking at categories. I'm looking at types of opportunity. At this level, I'm looking at specific things that I could buy and holding them up against specific things that I could sell. There typically would have a little bit more information. And what I've done, and it's maybe not that easy to see, I've taken OPEX and I've split it out into drilling costs and lifting costs. And I've taken risk and volume, the reservoir products here, and I've added things about reservoir quality and recovery per well. What this does is give me a slightly more sophisticated model that gives me slightly less variance in the outcome, which makes it easier to make decisions between those more detailed, specified assets to choose between. But the other thing that it does is it allows me to understand what it is that I'm looking for, what's important here. And one of the things that we found was that the oil business chases volume a lot. It goes after big finds because it's nice, you know, you write press release. We found, you know, 1 trillion barrels, great. But actually, in terms of making money, very often it's not really the size that's important. It's how quickly you can drain it. It's how quickly you can produce the oil. It's how quickly you can get the oil out in the important early sort of 5 to 10 years there. And in that respect, it's much more about reservoir quality. So what we found was instead of chasing volume in some of these places, you're actually better off chasing reservoir quality. And that's an interesting thing. And that's how, you know, that can inform the work that people are doing. And it, again, leads you to better decisions. But it's very, you know, it's absolutely impossible to have that kind of revelation without this kind of model. The interesting thing is, that kind of revelation is available to you even before you get into the detailed mathematical modeling. Maybe not the actual result of that, but the possibility that that could be the case comes out of the causal map when you see, well, actually recovery, well, that goes into drilling costs and that hits the cost recovery. That's very interesting. And then you can see how those things hang together. This is actually the takeaway slide that I have from the earlier presentation, and it really, again, it's just about sort of extolling the virtues of this kind of approach to modeling, and maybe not so much to modeling as to managing the dialogue between stakeholders, executives, senior management, employees, whatever, on the one hand, and then the analysts and the modeling people and the people who are doing the sort of decision support work on the other, and really sort of making a big pitch for this sort of causal mapping approach as a way of, in the first place, combining the rigor of uncertainty modeling with the intuition of causal modeling, and in the second place, providing a framework, a platform where everyone can get around the table together and agree and feel a sense of ownership and a stake in the model that's being produced, and as a consequence, the decisions that are made on the basis of it. Thank you very much for your time.